In the world of drums, generally speaking, the word choked is a negative thing. Today, we're going to set that aside and get into diagnosing just what is happening when we're hearing choking on our drum and whether or not we can make a better choice to get the sound we're after. I want to say again up front, this is not a video about how your drum is choked and that's a bad thing. What we're talking about here is that kind of behavior can come from a lot of different places on the drum, and also a lot of our favorite sounds from the past include some degree of choking. So we want to identify all the places that it can be coming from, particularly if you're hearing a specific behavior in your drum. There are three main culprits when it comes to hearing a choked sound coming from your drum. Before we get into those, let's define an unchoked sound with this demonstration. The things to pay attention to here are primarily that the sound of the drum is opening up as we play it harder, and that we're not hearing a prevalence of any particular overtone over any other. It's a general, warm sound that works through the whole dynamic range. We're also deliberately tuning this drum in the middle of its range because we're going to be deviating from that a little bit over the course of the choke demos. Now, let's move into our specifically choked demonstration, starting with this first example. This is basically the same tuning that we had before, but this is an example of the wires being way too tight. What's happening here is we're essentially stifling the capacity for this drum to resonate and have any kind of sustain in an effort to, most likely, get more articulation out of the snare wires. By tightening the wires this much, we're effectively turning them into a pretty intense muffling agent on the resonant side of the drum. Because we don't see that from this side the way that we would see muffling stuff put onto the batter head, it's easy to forget that with that much pressure on the snare side, we are really stifling the ability of the drum to resonate throughout the dynamic range. At the same time, this is also symptomatic of a lot of really great recordings from the past, particularly funk records from the 60s and a lot of dance music from that time period too, because they were looking for a punchy short sound, and this is a pretty quick way to get there, albeit losing some of the abilities of the drum to do the rest of what we might want out of it. This is a great opportunity for us to take a moment and practice reconditioning our ears to the idea of hearing a little bit more snare wire response and a little bit broader of a sound out of the wires. If you're really looking for a tighter, shorter, and more crisp sound, this is also an opportunity to experiment with different wires, either made of stiffer material or possibly that just have less wires on them, perhaps a 12 or a 16 strand set. If your drum currently features 30 or 42 strand wires, you may actually be getting choking out of that drum without even realizing it, because there's actually so much snare wire real estate going on there that you're hearing sound out of the wires and completely missing the fact that the resonant head can't really move at all anymore. Ultimately, this is going to affect the projection of that drum, particularly with rim shots, and really take out a lot of the tone. On to scenario number 2. Let's give this one a listen. This one may be a little bit more obvious to the ear. This is a very, very tight batter. We left the snare side alone, which is going to come into play in a second, but this is what you're going to hear when the snare is tuned so high on the batter side that the head essentially can't move once you reach a certain dynamic level. This is another instance where there are a lot of other ways to get this kind of sound out of the drum, but an awful lot of the time you run into instruments, maybe your friend owns one, or maybe it's a drum of yours that you don't use that much, where you sit down to play it and go, oh, it doesn't feel great. I'm just going to pitch it up a little bit. And before long, there's nowhere for that head to move anymore. What this results in is incredible response at very low dynamic levels, but as you start to play harder, the dynamics top out and you don't get that wonderful behavior of the sound opening up and changing as you hit it harder. It will get louder with anything you hit. It's going to get louder the harder you hit it, but you don't have the actual resonance and behavior in the drum of it getting bigger as it gets louder. This is reminiscent of a previous episode where we were installing snare side heads on the bottoms of our toms and discovered that as we moved from very quiet to very loud, they basically stopped growing about halfway through, and you could hit them harder, but you're not actually getting more sound out of the drum anymore. This is also a super common sound to hear on recordings. It's not necessarily a bad sound, but it is symptomatic of the absolute ceiling of what this batter head is capable of. If you're hearing pitches in this range and feeling like your batter head is definitely choked out, this is a good time to start to look at, frankly, smaller drums. There's also the possibility of moving to a thinner or maybe a lot thinner batter head to get a little bit more movement out of it at these high tensions, but the flip side of that is that the lifespan of that head will be shorter if it's that much thinner. We also want to mention that this type of choking oftentimes happens when you've had a batter on the drum for a very long time, played it a lot, and tried to keep it in the same pitch range by slowly pitching it up over time to try to stay in the zone that you like. There's a limit to how stretched out a drum head can be. Over time, it's going to choke out whether you want it to or not, and it's very hard to tell without taking the head off or experimenting with tuning it lower and seeing if it's even capable of doing a mid-range pitch. And finally, scenario 3, the very, very, very cranked snare side head. This is the one out of these three that seems to be something that people are told explicitly to do to their drum for the sake of a best sound or a correct sound. And if you've been with us for any length of time, you know that we don't really believe in best or correct sounds. It's just a matter of whether or not it's doing what you need it to do. What this is doing for us is choking the batter head, actually. It's making it really hard for the batter to have a clear fundamental and any kind of sustain around that fundamental, which results in a lot of overtones. And unless you hit it in the center circle of like about an inch, you're going to get a lot of sustain out of the harmonics, but nothing really out of the fundamental. This is why you see a tremendous amount of crank that snare side head, tune the batter to feel, and then muffle. And muffle, and muffle, and muffle. Because obviously, there's a lot of overtones going on over there, and we got to do something with those, right? Ironically, by having the snare side head tuned a little bit lower as it was at the beginning of the video, we didn't have this problem. We didn't have an amount of overtones that required such a tiny strike zone or a bunch of muffling to get around. If you have a drum of any size at all, it doesn't matter what kind of drum it is, and you feel like you're getting a ton of overtones out of your batter head, the first thing to do is check the snare side and make sure that it is not actually causing that to happen. Because it's super confusing, right? We're hitting the batter, we're hearing all this stuff. Surely it's the batter's fault, right? Obviously, we also have the aside of, if the snare side is cranked this high, we may have damaged it to the point where it's not going to behave properly in a mid-tuning anyway. So hopefully, if you're experiencing this, the head hasn't been on there for that long and you might be able to pitch it down and get something usable. But this is the one out of these where it might be time to replace that head. With regards to this really tight snare side head, we need to say a word about projection here too. There are certain sounds that feel like they should be projecting when you're sitting at the kit. This goes for the ultra tight snare wires, this goes for the ultra tight batter, and it also goes for the ultra tight snare side head. The sound is faster in front of us because something is choked. There's no sustain. And that seems like it should carry out to the audience, like it should really be powerful. But the fact of the matter is, we need resonance to carry that far. And if we are stifling the resonance from any direction, or maybe 2 or 3 of these things are happening at once, it's going to result in you feeling like you're really killing it where you're sitting, and it's going to sound thin and hollow and lifeless at a distance. If you're saying to yourself, well, my drums are all close mic'd, it's going to get out to the audience and the rest of it, no problem. Well, the fact of the matter is we still have the same problem, which is that transient, yeah, it's super loud, it's super bright, and it's super short. If they raise the volume on the microphones to manage that transient, the rest of that tone that's now not there, there's no way any of that has any chance of getting into that microphone. They may even be using compressors on your snare mic to try to manage that super bright attack, which is only going to cause bigger problems because you're going to lose your articulation, and you also don't have any body under that sound. At this point, you may be saying to yourself, well, now I know that there are 3 things to look for if I feel like I'm getting a choked sound out of my drum. That's true, but the fact of the matter is, if you're experiencing choking, there's probably a confluence of 2 or 3 of these things happening. So if one of the examples we did today shows you something that sounds really close to the issue that you're having, start with that. And if not, the greatest thing to do is to just relax the tension on everything. Lower the tuning on the batter a little bit, lower the tuning on the snare side, release the tension on the wires a little bit, and bring yourself back to a more resonant, more snare wiry sound, and then slowly dial it back and try to get toward a sound that's working for you while listening that tone remains throughout and doesn't start to get squashed out. As you take what we talked about today and dive into diagnosing these problems in your drums, remember that any adjustment we're talking about here can be very, very small. A half a turn on the snare mechanism could be the difference between choked wires and not. A half a turn on the batter head, same thing. Take your time, move slowly, and remember to listen at every step along the way. That's the way to do it.